The room had been arguing for 6 hours. I know that sounds like the beginning of something ordinary. A long meeting, too many voices and not enough agreement. But nothing about that chamber was ordinary, and I had stopped believing in ordinary the moment I took this post 3 years ago. My name is Viel. I am an ambassador of the Chorathi Compact, and I have served on the Galactic Interspecies Council long enough to know when something is about to go wrong. I have watched star systems change hands across a bargaining table. I have seen species with fleets of 10,000 vessels fold under the quiet weight of a well-placed word. I have sat through sessions that lasted 4 standard days without a single recess, with delegates from 17 worlds shouting at each other, in 17 different languages while the translation arrays in the ceiling did their best to keep up. Nothing in my career, nothing in my training, nothing in the 30 years I have spent watching the great civilizations of this galaxy push and pull at each other, had prepared me for what happened when the humans stopped smiling. But I am getting ahead of myself. The session that morning had started with a dispute over mineral extraction rights in the Orvith Belt, which was the kind of dispute that looked simple on paper, and turned into something considerably more complicated the moment lawyers from 4 different species started quoting 4 different versions of the same treaty. The Myrathi hegemony, who occupied 3 of the 7 council seats with the most procedural power, had been quietly steering the conversation since the opening statement. They were good at that. They had been doing it for longer than most species in the chamber had possessed faster than light travel. High Arbiter Sen sat at the head of the Myrathi delegation. He was tall even by Myrathi standards, with the characteristic bone ridges along his brow that indicated senior ranking, and he spoke with the kind of measured certainty that comes from knowing you have already won before the session begins. He had that look today. He had worn it all week. I watched him from my position at the Chorathi table, 3rd row from the center, with a clear line of sight to the human delegation just across the arc of the chamber. There were 3 humans at their table, 2 aides, both young, both keeping their heads down and their data readers in front of them, and then there was Counselor Mira Okafor. She was not physically imposing. That was always the first thing I had to remind visiting delegates about humans, because so many of them expected something more dramatic. They had read the files. Every species on the council had read the files. And then the human delegates walked in, and they were smaller than expected, softer looking than expected, and they smiled at you in a way that made your nervous system calm down before your brain had a chance to ask why you were letting it. Okafor was somewhere in her early 50s by human reckoning, which placed her in what they called the prime of middle age. She had short, neat hair, dark brown skin, and the kind of face that always seemed slightly amused, as if she was privy to a joke that the rest of the room had not yet heard. She dressed simply. She never wore the elaborate formal robes that most senior delegates adopted, which was either an oversight or a statement, and with humans, I had learned, it was almost always a statement. She was smiling when I looked at her. She had been smiling all morning. That was not unusual. The smile was her default expression in session, and it was the default expression of the 3 human ambassadors who had held this post before her. There was a theory among the senior council members that humans smiled in stressful situations as a kind of voluntary nervous system override, a way of sending a false calm signal to their own bodies. One of the xenobiologists on the research staff had told me this with great confidence. I had passed the theory along at a Chorathi briefing, and my superior had simply stared at me and asked why any species would do that to themselves. I did not have a good answer. What I knew, from personal experience, was that the smile made other species underestimate Okafor. New delegates did it constantly. They would see the easy expression, hear the warm tone she used when she spoke, watch her laugh at something a Keth aide said during a recess, and they would quietly move her down their internal list of people to worry about. They would focus on the Marathi, or the Vel Sarathi block, or the Drenok representative who always arrived 2 hours late, and then tried to dominate whatever remained of the session. This was, I had come to understand, exactly what she wanted them to do. Okafor had been on the council for 11 years. In those 11 years, humanity's position had shifted from a newly admitted species with no leverage and no fleet presence to something that was considerably harder to categorize. They did not have the largest ships. They did not have the oldest treaties. By conventional metrics of galactic political power, they should have been peripheral, a curiosity, a minor voice on minor matters. Instead, they were threaded through everything. Every significant trade agreement signed in the past decade had a human mediator somewhere in its construction. Every territorial dispute that had been resolved without escalating had, at some point, involved a human representative making a quiet suggestion that nobody remembered suggesting until they looked back at the record. The Charathi Compact's own resource agreement with the Palani Federation, which had secured our access to half the rare earth deposits in the outer quadrant, had been drafted during a meeting that Okafor had arranged and then declined to attend, saying she had something else scheduled. I had checked her schedule for that day. She had attended a cooking class. 3 of our people had asked her, separately, whether that was intentional. She had smiled at all 3 of them and said that she simply enjoyed learning new things. I had stopped trying to find the angle after the 2nd year. The mineral rights session continued. Sen's delegation introduced a procedural submotion at the 40-minute mark, which was standard Mirathi technique. They would flood the record with submotions until the opposing side was too buried in procedure to mount a coherent counter. The 4 minor species affected by the Orvath dispute, small civilizations, newer members, without the staffing to manage a procedural war, were already struggling. Their delegates looked tired. 2 of them were visibly leaning together, sharing a data reader, which meant they had already pooled their legal staff. Okafor watched all of this. She made notes on the small pad she always carried, a physical paper pad, which was another thing that had puzzled every delegate who noticed it. When someone had asked her about it once, years ago, in a recorded session I had reviewed, she had said that she liked to draw when she was thinking. The questioner had not known what to do with that answer. She drew a small shape in the corner of her page now. I was too far away to see what it was. The session broke for a midday recess. The chamber noise dropped from organized argument to loose conversation, and the movement of bodies toward the refreshment area along the north wall. I made my way toward it, exchanging brief acknowledgments with the Keth ambassador and one of the Vel Sarathi aides, and found myself beside Okafor at the edge of the room. "You're very quiet today," I said. I spoke in Intersol, the common diplomatic language, which she used easily and without an accent. "I'm listening," she said. "You're always listening. You're usually talking as well." She smiled at that. "I have everything I need from talking for now. Listening is more interesting." She picked up a small cup of something warm from the service counter and turned to look back at the chamber. "Sen is in a good mood. He usually is, when he has already decided how a session will end." "Yes," she said. "He usually is." She said it pleasantly. She was still smiling. There was nothing in her voice that I could point to and call concerning, but something in the way she said it made me look at her more carefully, and when I did, I noticed something I had not registered before. The smile was on her face. It had been on her face all morning. But it had not, at any point, reached her eyes. I filed that observation away somewhere in the back of my mind, and told myself I was reading too much into the expression of a species I would never fully understand. I refreshed my own drink. The recess bell sounded. We went back to the table. It was not until the afternoon session, 4 more hours deep into a procedural tangle that was beginning to feel less like a dispute and more like a slow enclosure, that I understood what I had actually seen. The smile was still there, but it was doing something different now. It was holding. Counselor Mira Okafor had been smiling for 6 hours straight, in a room where everything was quietly going wrong, and the smile had not changed once. Not when Sen's team scored a procedural point that visibly deflated the Orvath bloc delegates. Not when the Drenok representative made a comment that was technically within protocol and practically a provocation. Not when one of her own aides leaned over and whispered something in her ear that made the aide's face go tight with worry. She just kept smiling. And in my 30 years on this council, I had learned one thing about humans, that I trusted above all the files and the theories and the xenobiological reports. When they stopped doing something they had been doing consistently, it meant something had changed. And when nothing visible had changed, that was the most dangerous kind of change there was. I looked at Okafor again. She caught my gaze across the table. And for just a moment, something passed through her expression that I could not name. It was not worry, it was not anger. It was closer to the look a very experienced card player gets when they decide they have waited long enough. Then the smile settled back into place, exactly as it had been. I picked up my stylus. My hand was, I noticed, not entirely steady. The session continued. I kept watching. The next morning, I arrived at the council chamber, 40 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin. I told myself this was habit. I am an early arrival by nature. I like the quiet of a room before it fills, the way the empty chairs hold a kind of potential. Everything's still possible before the first word is spoken. I have been doing this since my first posting, 12 years before I ever heard the name Okafor or knew what a human smile meant. But I was lying to myself, and I knew it before I even sat down. I was there because I wanted to see her arrive. The chamber filled slowly. Aides set out materials. The technical staff ran their translation array diagnostics with the low hum that always preceded a full session. The Keth ambassador came in at his usual time, 22 minutes before the hour, and gave me a nod as he passed. The Drenic delegate arrived exactly on the hour, and immediately began arguing with the session coordinator about his assigned seating, which was also usual. Okafor arrived at 7 minutes before the hour. She walked in with her 2 aides, the same young pair from yesterday, both of them moving quickly to keep up with her pace, which was slightly faster than it had been the morning before. She wore the same simple style of dress. She carried her paper pad under one arm, and her face, as she came through the door, was calm and composed and professional. There was no smile, not yet, but not absent in a worried way, simply neutral, reserved, the expression of someone who had made a decision and was now enacting it. She sat down. She opened her pad. She uncapped her pen and drew a short line on the corner of the page, the kind of unconscious mark a person makes when they are settling into concentration. I found that I was holding my breath. The session coordinator called the room to order. High Arbiter Sen entered last, as he always did, the Mirathi preference for symbolic entrance timing being one of their more transparent habits. He took his seat with the smooth unhurry of a person who believes all available time belongs to him. He scanned the room once, a practice sweep that paused on the major delegations and dismissed the minor ones. His gaze passed over Okafor and continued moving. The smile was not there to dismiss. I watched Sen's gaze pause. Come back. Find her face without the smile it expected, and find something else there instead. Something that made his scan slow just slightly, like a system encountering unexpected input. He recovered quickly. He was too experienced not to. But the pause had been there. The session opened with a continuation of the mineral rights matter. 2 hours into the proceedings, Sen's team introduced the second procedural motion I had been expecting since the previous day. It was more aggressive than the first, a direct reclassification proposal that would shift the Orvith Belt's designation from contested to Mirathi adjacent, which was a category that had been quietly inserted into council taxonomy 3 years ago, and that most minor delegations had not noticed until it was too late to object to its inclusion. The Orvith bloc representatives responded with visible alarm. They had good reason to be alarmed. The reclassification, if it passed procedurally, would strip their primary claim before the substantive vote was ever held. It was elegant, in the way that things designed to be invisible until they close around you are elegant. Okafor set down her pen. Not forcefully. There was no sound. She simply placed it on the table, parallel to the edge, with the careful positioning of someone who is choosing not to do things casually. The delegate beside me, a junior Charathi aide named Orn, leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "Is she going to say something?" "I don't know," I said. "She's been very quiet all morning." "Yes," I said, "she has." The procedural motion went to its first reading. Sen's secondary delegate, a sharp and efficient woman named Councillor Drev, stood to formalize it. She spoke in the measured, precise cadence of someone reciting something they have prepared thoroughly. The translation array kept pace. The Orvith representatives were conferring in low, urgent voices. And then Okafor raised her hand. It was a small gesture, the standard parliamentary signal for a request to address the chamber. Routine, the kind of thing that happened dozens of times in a full session. But the room noticed it the way a room notices a sound it wasn't expecting, in a place that had been very quiet. The session coordinator acknowledged her. Councillor Okafor. The chair recognizes the human delegation. She stood. She did not look at her notes. She did not look at her aides. She stood, and she looked at the chamber. All of it. The full arc of 17 delegations. The technical staff, the coordinator, and finally Sen. She did not smile. "I would like to request a recess," she said. Her voice was level, not cold, not heated. Simply exact, the way a tool is exact when it has been made for a specific purpose. 40 minutes. I would like to speak with High Arbiter Sen and his senior staff privately before we continue. Sen's expression did not change visibly, but his hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, shifted, just slightly. The Mirathi delegation sees no procedural necessity for a recess at this juncture, Drev said, standing smoothly. The motion is already in its first reading. I understand, Okafor said. I am not making a procedural objection. I am making a request. There is a difference. She looked at Sen directly, not at Drev. High Arbiter, 40 minutes. The silence in the room lasted approximately 3 seconds. In a chamber where translation arrays managed 17 languages simultaneously, and background noise was a constant, 3 seconds of actual silence was remarkable. Sen said, "We will take the recess." Drev sat down. Nobody looked more surprised than the Orvith delegates. I watched one of them touch her colleague's arm, and then stare at her own hand, as if uncertain she had done it. Orn leaned toward me again. "What just happened?" "I think," I said slowly, "that the session just changed." "Did she win something?" I watched Okafor collect her pad from the table and move toward the private corridor behind the east wall, the small conference space reserved for bilateral discussions. 2 of Sen's staff were already following her. Sen himself was a step behind them, and he was wearing the expression of a person who is excellent at not showing things and is currently working very hard at it. "I don't know yet," I said. And that was the truth. I did not know. But I knew that 6 hours ago, the smile had been in place, and the situation had felt like something moving in a clear direction. And now the smile was gone, and the direction was less clear than it had been since the session began. In my experience, when a human's face went still, the most important thing you could do was pay attention to everything else that moved around it. I paid attention. Every senior delegate in that chamber was doing the same thing. I could see it in the quality of their stillness. The Keth ambassador had not touched his data reader in 4 minutes. The Vel Sarathi pair were not speaking to each other, which was so unusual it was almost alarming. Even the Drenok delegate had stopped his usual low-level procedural muttering and was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at the east corridor door. Nobody was checking their messages. Nobody was conferring with their aides. Everybody was waiting. Because whatever Mira Okafor had walked into that private room to say, they understood. The way experienced people understand things without being told explicitly. That it was the kind of thing you needed to be paying attention to when it came back out the other side. The 40 minutes passed. The door opened. Sen came out first. He walked back to his seat with the careful, measured steps of a person who is making sure their body is not saying anything their face is not authorizing. He sat down. He straightened his materials. He looked at nothing in particular. Then Okafor came out. She walked to her table. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She looked at the page in front of her. And slowly, like the first light coming back after a system outage, like something returning to its default position after an interruption, the smile came back. Small at first, then settled, then exactly what it had been for the last 11 years. Easy, warm, slightly amused, giving nothing away, and somehow making everyone in the room feel that things were, on balance, fine. She caught me looking. She gave a small nod, the kind of nod that carries an entire sentence in it. Something like, "Yes, I know what you saw." Something like, "Yes, it meant what you think it meant." Then she turned back to her page and drew something in the corner. The session coordinator called the chamber to order. High Arbiter Sen withdrew the procedural motion. He did not give a reason. He simply said the Mirathi delegation was withdrawing the motion and that the matter would be re-entered at a future session, pending additional review. Drev said nothing. The Orvath delegates stared at the Mirathi table, like they were waiting for the rest of the sentence. There was no rest of the sentence. The morning continued. Okafor made 2 minor procedural observations, both constructive, both pleasant in tone. She asked a question about the extraction timeline that resulted in a 15-minute discussion and ultimately benefited the smaller delegations. She laughed once at something a Kethade said during a short procedural pause. She was, by every visible measure, exactly the diplomat she had been yesterday, and the day before, and for the past 11 years. But the chamber was different. I noticed it in the small ways. Sturm. People were sitting slightly more upright. Conversations between aides were slightly shorter. Sen's delegation, which had entered this morning with the comfortable ease of people operating on a predetermined plan, was operating differently now. Not loudly, not obviously, but the ease was gone. During the afternoon break, I walked to the east corridor, not because I had a reason to, just to look at the room. It was a standard consultation space. A table, 6 chairs, a translation console. Nothing remarkable. Nothing to tell me what had been said inside it. I stood there for a moment and thought about what I knew about humans. They had found faster-than-light travel 40 years ago by accident, while testing a different technology entirely. They had arrived in galactic space without a plan and without a guide, and had proceeded to make themselves, within 1 generation, essential to the functioning of an institution that had existed for 8 centuries. They had done this with a species that smiled when they were stressed, carried paper notebooks in a digital chamber, and laughed at things that weren't jokes. I thought about the files. Every species on the council had read the files. We had all agreed, at various points, that the files were the most alarming documents set in the council archive. A species with their history, with what they had survived, and what they had done to each other, and what they had built in spite of it, walking into a galactic community, and being friendly about it. Being warm. Remembering your name, asking after your colleagues, making you feel, with every interaction, that things were probably going to be fine. We had all agreed the files were alarming, and then we had filed them away, because the humans who walked in were smiling. And it is very difficult, on a sensory level, to be afraid of something that is smiling at you. I walked back to the main chamber. The session reconvened. Okafor was already at her table. She was smiling. Her pen was moving across the corner of her page. I sat down and pulled up my own notes and told myself that the most important thing I had observed today was the procedural withdrawal and its implications for the Orvath matter. But what I actually kept thinking about, for the rest of the afternoon and into the quiet of the evening after the session closed, was the 40 minutes, and the walk back out, and the moment the smile returned, not because something had been resolved, but because something had been decided. The next session was 2 days away. I spent most of the interval reviewing documents I had already read 3 times. I sent a briefing note to my superior at the Chorathi Compact that described the procedural withdrawal in straightforward terms and did not include my observation about the smile, because I did not know how to write it in a way that would read as analysis rather than nerves. On the morning of the 3rd session, I arrived 40 minutes early again. Okafor was already there. She was sitting at the human table with a cup of something warm, reading something on her small paper pad, and she looked up when I came in and gave me the easy smile and a small wave. I sat down. I thought, whatever she walked into that room to say, it worked. I thought, I have been on this council for 19 years and I have never seen a Mirathi procedural motion withdrawn without a counteroffer. I thought, I should find out what the counteroffer was. I did not find out. Not then. The records from private consultations were sealed by default for 60 days. Standard council procedure. And I was not senior enough to request early access without a formal reason. But I watched Okafor across the chamber, with her warm expression and her paper pad, and the easy way she occupied a room, and I filed away one more observation to sit alongside all the others. Humans smiled when they were stressed. They smiled when they were calm. They smiled when they were making you comfortable, and when they were making you trust them, and when they were remembering your name and asking after your family. And apparently, in the 40 minutes before a smile came back, they could dismantle a strategy that had been built over 3 years and presented in 3 languages across 6 procedural submotions, and walk out of the room looking exactly as they had when they walked in. I found that significantly more interesting than alarming. I found that significantly more alarming than anything else. The session began. Okafor set down her cup. She picked up her pen. She drew a small shape in the corner of her page, and I could see, even from across the chamber, that she was smiling the whole time she did it. I pulled up my notes and prepared for a very long day. The Mirathi did not bring back the procedural motion. I had expected them to. Sen's people were methodical. Withdrawn motions were almost always re-entered with modifications, softened or restructured to appear more palatable. That was the standard approach. You pulled back, you recalibrated, you returned with something that had the same effect from a different angle. I had seen it done successfully dozens of times. But 2 weeks passed, and then a month, and the Orvith matter moved through the normal schedule and was resolved along the standard lines, with the 4 minor civilizations retaining their primary claims and the Mirathi hegemony accepting a joint extraction framework with reduced but still significant access to the belt. It was not everything the Orvith bloc had wanted, but it was enough, and it was more than they had been likely to receive if the procedural reclassification had gone through. During the session where the final framework was adopted, I watched Sen during the vote. He cast his delegation's approval with the same measured efficiency he applied to everything. His face was composed, his posture was correct, but at the exact moment when the session coordinator confirmed the framework as adopted, his gaze moved across the chamber to the human table. A brief, involuntary movement, the kind that happens before conscious control can stop it. Okafor was writing something on her pad. She did not look up. She was smiling. I made a note. Life on the council returned to its usual rhythm. New disputes, new procedural complexities, the constant low-level negotiation of 17 species with 17 sets of priorities, attempting to govern a section of the galaxy through committee. Okafor participated in all of it with the same engaged warmth she always displayed. She asked questions. She proposed small adjustments that invariably made agreements more stable. She remembered the names of junior aides and the dietary preferences of senior delegates, and the specific treaty articles that individual representatives tended to cite under pressure. She was, as she had always been, everywhere in the room, and impossible to pin down. About 6 weeks after the Orvith resolution, during a routine trade facilitation session on a matter that did not involve humans directly, I found myself sitting beside Okafor at the informal consultation table during a break. We had fallen into the habit of brief conversations during recesses, nothing formal, the kind of ambient diplomacy that happened at the edges of proceedings rather than in the center of them. I have been thinking, I said, about the private consultation, before the Mirathi withdrew. She looked at me with the pleasant interest she gave most things. Have you? I have been thinking about it for 6 weeks. That's quite a long think. I am a thorough person. She smiled. What have you concluded? That I would very much like to know what you said to Sen in that room. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her cup. Then she looked back at me. Vael, she said, what do you know about humans and long-term planning? I considered the question. I know you think in longer time frames than most species expect. The files suggest a tendency toward extended investment strategies. The files, she said pleasantly. Yes. Is that relevant? Sen's procedural reclassification strategy was designed 18 months ago, she said. The taxonomy category he used was inserted into council records 3 years before that. during a session that lasted 11 days and produced 412 procedural entries. Most delegations' legal staff didn't flag it because it was buried in subsection amendments to an agricultural trade addendum. I stared at her. "We flagged it," she said. "When it went in. 3 years ago. 3 years, 2 months, and about 11 days. She picked up her cup. So when I walked into that consultation room, I was not improvising. I was using something I had been holding for 3 years. I was waiting for the right moment to use it. I thought about this. "What did you hold over him?" "Nothing inappropriate," she said. "Just information. The fact that we knew the taxonomy insertion was intentional and had documented it from the beginning. The fact that our legal staff had been building a challenge to that category for 2.5 years and were ready to file it the moment it was invoked. The fact that a formal challenge would take the matter out of this chamber entirely and put it into a process that would take 4 years and would not, in the end, be favorable to the Mirathi position. You gave him a choice between a controlled loss now and an uncontrolled loss later. I gave him accurate information and let him make a decision," she said. "That's all." "And he believed you?" "He asked to see the documentation. I showed him the first 40 pages. She set down her cup. "We had 312. I sat with that for a moment. "You carried 312 pages of legal preparation into a private consultation," I said. "I brought it on a data chip, much easier. For 3 years. We started earlier than that, actually. The initial analysis was about 3 years and 8 months ago, but the formal documentation started about 3 years back." She tilted her head slightly. "We like to be thorough. You let the session go all morning," I said. "You let the motion get to its first reading. I needed to be sure he was committed to it. If I had moved earlier, he might have withdrawn voluntarily and tried a different approach. I needed him to be far enough in that a withdrawal would cost him something visible." She paused. "Not a great deal. Just enough to make the alternative clearly better." I thought about the morning of that session. The neutral expression when she arrived. The smile in place but not reaching the eyes. The way she had set down her pen before asking for the recess. "You were calculating the exact moment," I said. "More or less." While smiling. She looked at me. "Yes," she said, while smiling. I did not say anything for a moment. "Vale," she said, and her voice was the same warm, easy tone it always was. "I want to be honest with you, because I think you are an observant person, and I respect that. The smile is real. I am not performing it. I genuinely enjoy this work, and I genuinely like the people in that chamber, including you." "But," I said. "But," she agreed. "The smile is also useful, and I have learned, over 11 years, that people respond to it in ways that give me information. When the smile is present, people act on certain assumptions, and those assumptions tell me what they think is happening, which is sometimes different from what is actually happening. And when the smile is not present?" She looked at me steadily. "When it's not there," she said, "it's because I've stopped needing to gather information. It means I already know what I need to know, and I am doing something with it." The break bell sounded. The other delegates began moving back toward the main chamber. Okafor picked up her pad and her cup and stood. "I wouldn't worry about it," she said pleasantly. "Most of the time things are fine. And when they're not." She smiled. It reached her eyes this time. Fully, easily. "I'll let you know," she said. She walked back into the chamber. I sat at the consultation table for a moment longer than necessary. 3 years of documentation on a data chip. A taxonomy entry flagged 2 months after it was inserted. A strategy held in reserve while the other side built theirs, and released at the precise moment it would do the most with the least. While smiling, I gathered my own materials and walked back into the session. I would be lying if I said I was not, at that moment, deeply glad that Mira Okafor was on the same side of the table as the Charathi Compact. And I would be lying if I said the relief was not accompanied by a very clear and very specific thought. She is on our side right now. Right now. I kept that thought in the front of my mind for the rest of the afternoon. 11 months after the Orvith resolution, the council entered what the administrative staff quietly called a dense period. That was their word for it. Dense, as in a period during which an unusually large number of significant matters arrived in close succession, each complicated on its own, each made more complicated by the others, the way a series of heavy objects placed on a single surface will eventually reveal whether the surface is as strong as it looked. The dense period began with a border renegotiation in the outer transit lanes that had been deferred 3 times in 18 months and could not be deferred again. It continued with a water rights dispute between 2 mid-tier civilizations that had been growing steadily less civil for the past year, and it escalated at the start of its 3rd week, when the Marathi hegemony introduced something none of us had seen before. They called it the Governance Alignment Proposal. The name was clean and procedurally neutral, which was, in itself, a warning sign. Marathi proposals with neutral names were invariably the ones you needed to read 3 times before you could locate the mechanism. I read it 4 times. The mechanism, when I found it, was this: a restructuring of council voting weights based on what the proposal called proportional influence metrics, a formula that incorporated fleet size, territorial extent, economic output, and council membership duration. Each of these factors was reasonable individually. Together, combined in the specific ratios the proposal used, they produced one clear effect. They reduced humanity's voting weight by 63%. Not eliminated. The proposal was careful about that. Humans would retain their seat, their voice, their procedural standing. They would simply have considerably less of it. The framing was so clean that it was almost possible to read it as purely administrative, the natural result of an objective formula applied neutrally to all delegations. Almost. I sent a note to my superior that evening with a single line underneath my summary. This is the largest structural move against a single delegation in council history that did not involve a formal expulsion proceeding. My superior replied with 2 words: watch Okafor. I had been watching Okafor. Since the proposal was introduced, 3 days ago, she had been her usual self. Warm, present, engaged in the parallel debates about the border renegotiation and the water rights dispute. She had made 2 useful contributions to the border talks and proposed a technical adjustment to the water arbitration framework that had moved the parties 12% closer to an agreement, according to the session coordinator's estimate. She was smiling. Every morning, smiling. Every recess, smiling. Every exchange with aides, with other delegates, with the session coordinator, with me. She was warm and approachable, and slightly amused and seemingly unconcerned about the proposal that had her delegation's name on it, and 63% of their voting weight about to be removed. I watched her across the chamber on the 4th day of the dense period, and thought about what she had told me 11 months ago. When the smile is not there, it means I already know what I need to know, and I am doing something with it. The smile was there, which meant she was still gathering. I tried to find comfort in that. On the 5th day, the governance alignment proposal went to its formal presentation. Sen delivered it himself, which was unusual. Senior Marathi arbiters did not typically present procedural proposals directly. That was staff work. The fact that he chose to present this one personally was the kind of signal that required attention. He spoke for 38 minutes. It was an excellent presentation. The formula was introduced gradually, each factor explained and justified independently before the combination was presented. The weighting methodology cited 7 historical precedents. 3 of those precedents, I noted, were from decisions made more than 200 years ago, before humans had discovered faster-than-light travel. The other 4 were from the past 30 years, all of them involving civilizations that had been significantly less integrated into council functioning than humanity currently was. But the presentation did not address integration. It addressed metrics. And on metrics alone, the formula was defensible. When Sen finished, the session coordinator opened the floor for initial responses. 3 delegations expressed cautious support, citing the importance of consistent standards. 2 delegations expressed concerns about the precedent, but did not oppose outright. The Orvith bloc, predictably opposed it, partly on principle, and partly because they had not forgotten 11 months ago. The session coordinator looked at the human table. Counselor Okafor, does the human delegation wish to respond at this time? I held very still. Okafor looked up from her page. She set down her pen, the same careful, deliberate placement I had seen once before, parallel to the table edge, without sound. She stood. She was smiling. The human delegation thanks the High Arbiter for a thorough presentation, she said. Her voice was exactly what it always was, easy, clear. We would like to request time to review the proposal in full, before entering a formal response. We understand the presentation has introduced a formula with some complexity, and we want to ensure our response addresses it properly. How much time does the human delegation require? The coordinator asked. 72 hours, she said. Sen's expression did not change, but beside him, Drev made a small movement, a shift of posture that I had learned, over years of watching the Mirathi delegation, indicated something she had not anticipated. The Mirathi delegation accepts the request, Sen said. Thank you, Okafor said. She sat down, she picked up her pen. The session continued. She participated in the water rights discussion for another 2 hours, and made 3 useful contributions, and smiled at an aide's comment about the catering during the afternoon recess. 72 hours, I thought. 3 days. I did not sleep well that night. I arrived at the chamber on the morning of the 72nd hour to find it more crowded than usual. The observation gallery, which was normally occupied by a scattering of junior staff and the occasional visiting dignitary, was nearly full. Word had moved through the council community in the way that important things always did. Quietly, and without any official announcement, traveling through the network of aides and administrative staff, who knew the shape of something significant before their superiors had finished reading the briefing notes. The human delegation was about to respond to the governance alignment proposal. Okafor arrived at her usual time, 7 minutes before the hour. Her 2 aides were with her, and they were carrying more than usual. Data readers, physical binders, a small external display unit that they set up at the edge of the human table. I had never seen the human delegation use a display unit in session. Okafor sat down. She opened her pad. She drew the small mark in the corner of the page that she always drew at the beginning of a session. She was smiling. The session was called to order. The coordinator confirmed that the 72-hour review period had elapsed and invited the human delegation to present their response. Okafor stood. She did not look at notes. She did not look at the display unit. She looked at the chamber. I want to begin, she said, by saying something that is not procedural. The room was very quiet. The governance alignment proposal is well constructed, she said. I want to acknowledge that clearly and without ambiguity. The formula is mathematically consistent. The precedents cited are real precedents. The framing is neutral in tone and correct in its procedural form. I want the chamber to understand that the human delegation has read this proposal carefully, and we recognize the craft in it. Sen was watching her with the careful attention of someone expecting a specific kind of argument. He was not going to get it. What I want to address, Okafor continued, is not the formula. It is the underlying question the formula answers. Because the formula, as constructed, answers a specific question. What is the smallest voting presence a delegation can have while technically retaining council membership? She paused. And I think before we vote on whether to apply that answer to any delegation, we should ask whether that was the question we meant to be asking. The chamber was still. The human delegation has prepared a document, she said. We are distributing it now. Her aides stood and moved through the chamber, placing physical copies on each delegation's table. A light copy, 6 pages, printed clearly. The display unit at the human table came on, showing the cover page. The title read, Council Integration Architecture, a 30-year record. This document, Okafor said, records every significant multi-party agreement reached in this chamber over the past 30 years, in which human mediation, human drafting, or human procedural participation was a material factor in the outcome. She waited while the delegates looked at their copies. I looked at mine. The first page was a summary list. I counted 47 entries before the page ended, and continued on to the next. "We are not presenting this as a threat," Okafor said, and her voice was entirely level. "We are presenting it as information. The governance alignment proposal is built on metrics that measure what a delegation brings in terms of territory, fleet, and economic output. Those are real things. They matter. But they do not capture what this document contains, which is the functional load that any delegation carries in the ongoing operation of this institution." She looked at Sen. She was still smiling, but it was the kind of smile I had not seen before. Not the easy, warm expression of a colleague in conversation. Something older, quieter. The smile of a person who has been patient for a very long time and has finally decided that patience has served its purpose. "The human delegation," she said, "does not oppose the principle of proportional representation. We support it. What we are asking the Chamber to consider is whether the specific formula presented captures the full picture of what proportionality should measure." She reached the table and picked up her pen. "We have prepared an alternative formula," she said. "It adds one factor to the existing set. That factor is what we are calling institutional load, a measure of the degree to which a delegation's participation is load-bearing for the Council's functioning. The methodology for calculating it is in Section 3 of the document." She sat down. "We welcome questions," she said pleasantly. The Chamber took a long moment to respond. The kind of moment where you can feel 17 delegations doing simultaneous calculations and none of them arriving at the same place. The Keth ambassador spoke first. "How was the institutional load factor calculated?" "Cross-referencing the record of every multi-party agreement, arbitration, and procedural resolution in the past 30 years, with the participation logs held by the session administration," Okafor said. "The raw data is in the appendix. All of it. We cross-referenced it against 3 different methodologies, and the results were consistent across all 3. And under your proposed formula," the Velsarathi senior delegate said carefully, "what is the human delegation's voting weight?" "Approximately 6% higher than the current standard," Okafor said. "But we are not proposing that this formula be applied only to the human delegation. We are proposing that it be applied to all delegations, equally, as the governance alignment proposal intends to do. If the Chamber wishes to restructure voting weights based on contribution metrics, we believe they should be complete contribution metrics." She looked around the room. "Under our proposed formula," she said, 4 delegations would see their weights increase. 11 would see no significant change. 2 would see reductions. She did not name the 2. She did not need to. I looked at the document in my hands, and then at the Mirathi table. Sen was very still. Drev had picked up her copy of the document and was reading Section 3 with the focused intensity of someone looking for a technical flaw and not finding it quickly enough. "We would also like to note," Okafor said, in the same pleasant, conversational tone, "that the Council administration has confirmed the completeness of the participation logs we used. We can provide the verification documentation to any delegation that wishes to review it." She picked up her cup, which had been sitting at the edge of the table throughout. "We think this is a productive conversation to have. We appreciate the High Arbiter for bringing it forward." She took a sip. She was smiling. The governance alignment proposal did not go to a vote that session, or the next session, or the one after that. By the time the dense period ended, 6 weeks later, the proposal had been quietly reclassified as a discussion item, pending further committee review, which was the procedural category from which very few things ever returned. The committee was assigned a review timeline of 18 months. The committee chair was a junior delegate from one of the minor civilizations who had voted against the proposal's advancement. Sen did not publicly object to any of this. During the session in which the reclassification was formalized, I watched him for a long time. He was composed and efficient and correct in all his procedural responses. At no point did he look at the human table. I thought that was the most interesting thing about the whole afternoon. After the session, I found Okafor in the corridor. I walked beside her for a moment without saying anything. Her aides were ahead of us, already working on the next day's preparation. 30 years, I said eventually. 30 years, she agreed. You documented every agreement. The session administration documented them. We just organized the data. For how long? She considered this. We started building the database about 8 years ago. It became more organized about 5 years back. We updated it quarterly. In case something like this happened. In case we needed to have a clear picture of what this institution actually does, and how it does it. She glanced at me. We needed to know that for our own purposes too. It helps with planning. I thought about that. You didn't know what you were going to use it for when you started, I said. Not specifically. But we knew that at some point, someone would try to argue that our contribution here was limited to the metrics that are easiest to see, and we wanted to be ready for that argument. She smiled. We like to be thorough. You said that before. It keeps being true. We walked for a moment in silence. The 2 delegations whose weights would have decreased under your formula, I said. You didn't name them. No. But everyone knew which 2 they were. They could do the math, she said. We didn't need to say it. That was deliberate. Saying it out loud would have made it feel like a confrontation. Letting them calculate it themselves made it feel like information. She paused. The outcome was the same, but the feeling in the room was different. I thought about that for a long time. We reached the end of the corridor, where it split toward the delegate exits. Veil, she said, and I turned. She was looking at me with the warm, clear expression she always had, the smile that was always there. You're still worried about something, she said. I am trying to understand something, I said. What? Whether I should feel reassured or not. She tilted her head slightly. We have never done anything to harm the Chorathi Compact, she said. We never will. You are, and have always been, people we consider partners. I know that. But I looked at her, at the smile, at the warmth in it, which was genuine, which I had confirmed for myself over years of small observations and quiet moments. But I keep thinking, I said, that the Mirathi thought they were partners too, at least functionally, at least for the purposes of day-to-day council work. She was quiet for a moment. That's perceptive, she said. And they were not wrong about that. We have always been willing to work with them constructively. We still are. But they moved against you. They made a calculation, she said. They believed that the contribution metrics supported a reduction in our formal standing. They were working from the information they had, which was not all the information. No, she said, it was not. She picked up her bag. The difference between us and them, she said, is not that we have more information. It's that we have been building the information for longer and more carefully. She paused. We have been in this galaxy for 40 years. Some of the species in that chamber have been here for 800. We are always going to be the newcomers. We knew that when we arrived. She looked at me. So we decided to be very, very good at knowing things. She said good night and walked toward the exit. I stood at the corridor junction for a while. 8 years of database construction, quarterly updates, 312 pages of legal documentation on a chip carried for 3 years, 30 years of agreement records organized into a single document that could be distributed in a session and reviewed in 40 minutes, and understood in the time it took to read a list. And through all of it, the smile. The easy, warm, genuine smile of a person who was enjoying the work and remembering your name, and asking after your colleagues, and drawing small shapes in the corners of a paper pad. I walked to my office, and sat at my desk, and did not start my evening review immediately. I thought about what it meant to be good at knowing things. I thought about 40 years versus 800. I thought about newcomers who decided early on that they would be very careful and very thorough and very patient, and then were all 3 things, consistently, for 40 years. While smiling. And then I thought about all the species in that chamber who had not noticed, who had seen the smile and decided it was the whole picture, who had read the files once, agreed they were alarming, and then filed them away because the person across the table was warm and friendly, and remembered your name. I pulled up my evening review. The first item was a preliminary briefing on the next session's agenda. The second item was an administrative note from the Human Delegations Office, copied to all senior ambassadors. It was a request for a routine coordination meeting about the water rights arbitration framework. Okafor's signature was at the bottom, with a short personal note in the margin that she had added by hand. Looking forward to it. Let me know if a particular time works better for your schedule. I looked at the note for a long time. Then I wrote back and confirmed the meeting. And I thought, 30 years of integration, 8 years of database building, 40 years of being very good at knowing things while seeming like the friendliest people in the room. I thought, I am glad we are partners. And underneath that, quiet and steady, and not quite going away, no matter how much I trusted the smile. I thought, I hope we stay that way. 7 weeks after the dense period ended, I did something I had been considering for most of my 19 years on the council and had never done. I went to find the oldest files. Not the summary files. Not the briefing documents distributed to new delegates, or the orientation materials the council administration prepared for newly admitted species. The oldest files. The ones kept in the restricted archive on the 4th level of the council complex, accessible by senior ambassadors for research purposes, requiring a formal access request and a stated reason. I wrote my reason as historical context for ongoing diplomatic preparation. It was accurate as far as it went. The archive was quiet when I arrived. A young administrative aide showed me to a reading terminal and brought me the relevant catalog, and I spent 4 hours going through documents that were, in some cases, older than my species council membership. The human files were extensive, not because we had added to them over the decades. The files themselves, the original assessment records compiled from first contact 40 years ago, were comprehensive on their own. The contact team that had made first communication with humanity had been thorough. They had requested extensive cultural and historical documentation before any formal proceedings began. They had received it. I read for 4 hours. I had read a summary version of these files before, years ago, as part of my standard onboarding. I remembered agreeing that they were alarming. I remembered filing that agreement away and getting on with my work. Reading the primary documents was different. It was not the scope of what humans had done to each other. That was alarming, but it was not unique. Many species had complicated histories. Violence and conflict and difficult passages from one stage of civilization to another were not peculiar to any one world. What was different, in the human files, was the recovery. Not just that they recovered from difficult periods. Many species did, but the specific way humans did it. The pattern that repeated, century after century, across different civilizations on the same planet that did not know about each other, different cultures separated by geography and language, all of them independently developing a similar response to difficulty. They documented everything, every failure, every conflict, every period of instability. They wrote it down, and they studied it, and they argued about what it meant, and they taught it to their children, and they argued about how to teach it, and they wrote more documents about the arguments. They had been building information for as long as they had been writing things down, and they had been writing things down for a very long time. I sat at the terminal and read, and thought about an 8-year database and quarterly updates, and a smile that meant, I am still gathering. I thought about 40 years in a galaxy that had not expected them. I thought about what happens when a species that has spent thousands of years learning how to know things and hold things and wait for the right moment arrives somewhere new and has the opportunity to start early. I thought about all of us who had read the summary files and agreed they were alarming, and then met the people, and found them warm and friendly, and had quietly decided the warmth was the important part. The aide came to let me know the archive was closing for the day. I thanked her and gathered my notes and walked out into the council complex's long afternoon corridor with its high windows and the pale light coming through. The next session was in the morning, Okafor would arrive 7 minutes before the hour. She would set out her pad and uncap her pen and draw a small mark in the corner of the page. She would smile. She would ask after someone's family. She would remember a name. She would make a useful observation about the water rights framework that moved the parties closer to agreement. She would be exactly what she had always been. And I would sit across the chamber and watch, and I would know, in a way I had not known fully before today, what the smile was and what it was not. It was real. I had never doubted that. But it was also the surface of something much larger, the part that was facing outward while the rest of it worked quietly in the background. The warm light in the window of a building that you had never looked at carefully enough to understand how deep it went. I walked back to my office. I had a briefing note to write. I started it 3 times and deleted all 3 starts. Eventually I wrote, "The human delegation's position on the council is significantly more structurally significant than our current assessment reflects. I recommend a full review of our bilateral relationship framework, not because anything has changed, but because I believe we have been measuring the relationship against an incomplete picture of what the relationship is." I sent it. Then I went home and made myself something to eat, and sat at my window and thought about a species that had been on this planet for thousands of years before they reached the stars, and had spent all that time learning how to know things, and had then arrived in a community of older civilizations and been warm and friendly and patient and thorough, and had quietly become the thing that held the most important room in the galaxy together, while everyone looked at the smile and thought that was the important part. I thought, we have been very fortunate. I thought, I hope we understand that. I thought about the session in the morning, the 7-minute arrival, the small mark on the corner of the page. I thought about the moment, 11 months ago, when the smile had not reached her eyes and I had noticed, and filed it away and told myself I was reading too much into it. I had not been reading too much into it. I had been reading exactly the right amount. I just had not understood, yet, what the reading meant. I understood it now. And I found that understanding it, fully, clearly, without the comfortable cushion of assuming the smile was the whole story, was not frightening in the way I might have expected. It was something else. Something closer to respect. The specific kind of respect you develop for something that has been working carefully and quietly for a very long time, and has never needed you to notice. The kind of respect that made you sit very straight in your chair the next morning. The kind that made you pay attention. The kind that made you, when the smile came through the door 7 minutes before the hour, look at it differently than you had before. Not with fear, with attention. Because a smile, once you understood what it was the surface of, was a very different thing from what you had thought it was. And the most important thing you could do with that understanding was not to be afraid of it. It was to make very sure you deserved it. I went to bed. In the morning, I arrived at the chamber 40 minutes early. She arrived at 7 minutes before the hour, with her pad under her arm, and her cup in her hand, and the easy warmth of someone who was genuinely glad to be in the room. She saw me already at my table. She smiled, and I thought, there it is, the thing that was real. The thing that was also a surface. The thing that told you everything was fine for as long as it was there, and told you something far more important the moment it was gone. I smiled back. We had a long session ahead of us. I was paying attention.